Greetings, I'm your host, Jason Miles, and welcome to another episode of This is Revolution Podcast for all the returning listeners and subscribers, of course, our very valued patrons. Thank you so much. So glad your guys are back. To those new to the channel, thank you for taking a moment to check us out. If you dig what we're doing, please hit like and, of course, subscribe. It goes a very long way in promoting the channel. K-Fabe episode 1. If basically, I believe that K-Fabe episode 1, actually the whole series, goes very well with the book we're talking about today. So much so that in reading the book, I was like, let me go give a copy to Peter. I think he's going to dig it. K-Fabe episode 1 is live on Means TV. That's right. K-Fabe and all the video essays we put out over the last few years are there. If you're new to this channel and don't know, we have some fucking rad video essay projects that we've done over the years that I would say are in the style of a person like Adam Curtis. I'm familiar with that guy. So if you dig that stuff, please go to Means TV and check it out, and all the other amazing left content they host. If you use the discount code, This is Revolution, all Hello, can you guys hear me? I believe I'm back. Oh, can you guys hear me? Sadly, the power went out. Yep. The power went out for 7 seconds, and that's how long it takes for everything to come back on when the power goes out for 7 seconds. So this is what Mexico said to me. "We coming for you, nigga!" And I had to take it because it drizzled outside. So that is the downside to having really horrible infrastructure, is that if it drizzles or if one of the wild horses kicks a power line, just other than that, the doesn't drizzle often. But my God. Don't forget, there are a few in-person events going on this week. First, tomorrow night around 6 p.m., Ben Burgess of Give Them an Argument will be at him and I will be at the world famous Rainbow Bar and Grill in West Hollywood to do our annual No Date Valentine's Day Commie Hang. That's right. If you're in LA and you're looking to do something more productive than break your personal gooning record, wash your hands and then come join Ben and I at the Rainbow. Then this Saturday, the 15th, Ben and I will be at UC Irvine to speak at the Platypus Affiliated Society's West Coast Conference. There's a couple of panels. I believe Ben will be on the first. Now, apparently, I'm on both panels. The first panel discussion will be the crisis of neoliberalism, and that starts at noon, goes until about 2. And then the second panel that starts at 4 is what is a political party for the left? Again, the conference will be held at the Humanities Gateway, 1030 at UC Irvine, starting at noon. And apparently it's open to the public because they told us to promote it. So if you hang with us on Lonely Guy Valentine's Day, then come hang with us on Incel Saturday. Be a good time. But today we are honored to have Dr. Peter MILONAS. I didn't even ask. We were talking. And I didn't ask, how do I say your last name right? Because I've been saying it wrong as I've been reading the book. Author of Capitalism's Safety Net, News, Media, and the Far Right, Dr. MILONAS' work explains the crucial role mainstream media plays in shaping political discourse, particularly in legitimizing far-right movements while reinforcing capitalist power structures. His book employs what he calls an open cultural Marxism framework to analyze how media functions, not just as a site of ideological struggle, but as an active participant in maintaining the economic and political status quo. In Capitalism's Safety Net, Dr. MILONAS argues that media institutions, even those traditionally labeled liberal, often serve as gatekeepers of capitalism by amplifying far-right populist rhetoric while marginalizing leftist alternatives. News organizations create a controlled ideological landscape. This process allows reactionary neoliberalism to flourish while suppressing socialist movements and working class resistance. His research connects media ownership concentration, infotainment culture, and the normalization of reactionary politics to the broader crisis of neoliberalism. In today's discussion, we will discuss some key themes from the book. How does right-wing media function as capitalism's ideological safety net? Why do liberal media outlets often prefer far-right populists over socialist candidates? And how can media consumers navigate this landscape critically? Please welcome a very patient man dealing with my power problems, Peter MILONAS. Am I saying it right?
You're saying it all right. Hi, Jason. It's actually MILONAS in Greek, but yeah, I've heard MILONAS, MILONAS. I've heard a ton of different variations. Now I just turn to whatever.
What messed me up is you have, I'm assuming it's your Greek name on your
Yeah.
email.
Yeah.
So I've been calling you something so crazy the whole time. So that's my bad. I apologize. First and foremost, you use the term cultural Marxism. I thought we weren't supposed to use that term after Jordan Peterson made it a bad word. You do define it in the book. How would you define cultural Marxism?
Okay, so with regards to cultural Marxism, this has nothing to do with what Jordan Peterson is saying. It
Mhm.
has nothing to do with the conspiracy theory, which is pretty much another way of saying the Frankfurt School and having, if you will, this anti Semitic, oftentimes rhetoric by using the term cultural Marxism. No, it has nothing to do with that. This is more in tune with using Marxist analysis of culture and using a variety of different theorists who may have opposing views, such as, for instance, um, the members of the Frankfurt School, or Althusser, or Gramsci, who talks about cultural hegemony, looking at ideological state apparatuses, and more specifically, the mass media and the media ideological state apparatus, bringing in the ideas of the Frankfurt School, like their ideas pertaining to the media and the cultural industries, and bringing all these different elements together, somewhat picking and choosing what suits this analysis best. So, yeah, it's something more of a trying to take different ideas from different scholars to explain what's going on in the mass media today. It has nothing to do with, again, the kind of cultural Marxism that someone like Jordan Peterson's talking about. And we've seen that he really doesn't know much about what he's talking about when it comes to Marxism. I've picked up a book of his or two where he tackles the subject. I was here in Toronto at the debate with Slavoj Žižek. Unfortunately, if he was in a course on Marxism, he wouldn't pass that grade. He wouldn't pass. He doesn't know much pertaining to it.
How did you like that debate with him and Zizek?
Honestly, I thought it was pretty entertaining, and the best thing was seeing how many people ended up agreeing with Zizek when they saw in front of them an articulate, self-described Marxist, Hegelian, Lacanian theorist who was actually very well prepared to go toe-to-toe with Peterson. And yeah, I went with a friend. I saw a bunch of other friends and colleagues. It was a fun time, and it was even more fun knowing that the Toronto Maple Leafs were like in the playoffs, just playing the street, and we had a packed arena ourselves.
Oh wow!
Yeah, it was crazy. It was crazy. So many people were there, and yeah, it was sold out. I want to say.
Would you say it was majority Jordan Peterson fans?
To be honest with you, I'm not sure. I mean, there were a lot of Jordan Peterson fans, that's for sure. And even people that I know who went there found some of his ideas to be somewhat appealing.
Mm-hmm.
But at the end of the night, they found themselves agreeing with Zizek and seeing how ill prepared Peterson was actually made them somewhat see the light, if you will, that this man isn't as well informed as they think he is.
Interesting.
Yeah, that was interesting for me. So I went with somebody, actually a good friend, a colleague from the university, and he's not the biggest fan of Zizek, and he certainly isn't a fan of Jordan Peterson. But at the end of that debate, he found himself actually really liking Zizek and researching him a bit more, picking up a book of his. So he came across as, well informed.
Well, let's get back to your book, which is very informative. Again, wherever you guys are watching or listening to this show, there's a link in the description so you can pick up the book. Your book explores how capitalist media legitimizes far-right ideologies. Can you explain how this process works, especially in times of economic crisis?
So, in times of economic crisis, what we see is a lot of people are upset, and rightfully so, with the status quo. They're upset with traditional political parties. They're upset with politicians. They want to see some kind of change. They want to see their lives improve. During these times, especially in most Western societies, where political parties, up until I would say the 2008, 2000, let's say 2011 global financial crisis, because again, I'm also considering Europe, and they were in a really terrible state during the mid 2010s, like Greece, Portugal, Spain, Italy, and so on and so forth. Or the UK, Brexit, of course. 2016, we have the election of Trump. But around 2008, what we see is this breakdown of this traditional kind of center right, center left dominance in politics. These two parties had become somewhat indistinguishable between them, having, for example, a lot of the same financial policies. Maybe the center left was a little bit more generous and still upheld something of a welfare state. And the real differences being, if you will, if there were any, on some social policies. So seeing this breakdown, seeing people being frustrated with the status quo, they start looking elsewhere for, if you will, solutions. Obviously, you have the left, which is ever present, but somewhat marginalized. You have these socialist parties, some radical social democratic parties, and so on and so forth. Or even within some of these center left parties, you have these more radical socialist voices that oftentimes are ignored and or overlooked. And then you have the emergence of the far right, which, going back to the emergence of the original fascist in Italy with Mussolini, and later on seeing far-right political parties and movements start to appear all over Europe in the period between the First and the Second War, in times of crises, offering a different kind of solution, an alternative to both the traditional political establishment and the left. These parties bank on nationalism, chauvinism, xenophobia. They try and muster, if you will, people around a common enemy. The people, as they like to say, facing some sort of enemy. We saw, like, for instance, the rise of anti-Semitism and attacking Jewish people during that time. Or you see, for instance, attacking other minority groups. Today, you see it's this almost full-blown, again, war on immigrants and refugees, the othering and the, again, demonization of particular groups. So this all leads to the appearance of this other alternative, which oftentimes oversimplifies situations. They don't have the kind of, if you will, deep economic analyses that the left has. They stay away from things like Marxian economics, or trying to explain how the economy functions, or society, social structures, all these things that you hear professors talk about, and left-wing politicians, activists, and so on. They have a much more simplified message. So this brings us to the media.
Mhm.
The media loves simple. The mass media loves, if you will, simple kind of black and white narratives. The media loves these kind of approaches to politics, like good versus evil and blah, blah, blah. So, on the one hand, you have a group with an oversimplified message, one that actually resonates with a lot of people, one that becomes quite popular in times of crises because they offer the kind of explanations that tend to convince a lot of people instead of getting into these deep, like, again, analyses of how the economy functions and politics. This is all very appealing. And the way that it's appealing to a lot of voters, it's also appealing to the media. And then there's other components. As I said, they're nationalistic, they're xenophobic, and so on. This spells controversy as well. And as you know, nothing serves the modern commercial media more than controversy. Controversy sells, right? Sensationalism sells. So what you have slowly by slowly is this perfect storm, if you will, emerging, where everything seems to fall into place for these extremist political parties. And then there's also the fact that, unlike the left, they don't challenge capitalist power structures. They talk about the elites and going toe to toe with the elites, but their elites aren't, if you will, the super wealthy. Their elites aren't individuals who are taking advantage of workers. No, their elites are university professors, members of minority groups. They're everybody. They're, for some reason, I don't know how, refugees and immigrants become elites, but for some reason they're also piled up with them. And all of this tends to be, if you will, reproduced in the mass media, which, even when it's critical, has the tendency to benefit the far right. And we can get into that a little bit more, because I understand I'm like going on and on,
No,
because
no, no. You're fine. You're fine. You're fine.
such
You're
a
fine.
such a like uh a broad, if you will, kind of like statement of, yes, they prefer the far right because they're controversial and controversy sells. But it's also the fact that they don't challenge power structures the way that the left does. They don't talk about, for instance, media concentration, and they don't talk about a lot of these topics that we find to be highly problematic. They might just talk about, I don't know, fake news and the fact that they may challenge their leaders. But from there on, we can even get into that and why these media platforms continue to report on these groups.
You argue that so-called liberal media, reinforce capitalist structures. And when we say liberal media, you mentioned CNN, the New York Times.
Yeah.
How do they contribute to the process as well? Because I think people look at them as maybe less courtiers of the right, but the New York Times definitely went right along with the government line about what was going on in Gaza, and CNN is a little right wingish as well, just not as racist.
So, with regards to these media outlets, I have this entire analysis on primary and secondary research looking at, for instance, how someone like Bernie Sanders was treated during the 2016 and then 2020 elections, as opposed to Hillary and Joe Biden and Donald Trump in both cases. What we see is such a negative coverage of someone like Sanders from CNN, MSNBC, the Washington Post, a lot of these media outlets that traditionally we tend to consider liberal and serious media outlets that we trust for our daily dose of information and news,
Mhm.
having a much more critical outlook on Sanders as opposed to the candidates he was running against in the Democratic primaries. And this has to do, again, with all the candidates, because it wasn't obviously just Clinton and Biden.
It's like a clown car of candidates.
Yeah, I mean, there are so many of them. And it seemed like Sanders was offering a kind of alternative to their views, which tended to pretty much coincide. So he was the obvious outsider in the Democratic primaries. But again, the coverage of him was pretty negative, and there is a lot of research that shows that. Content analyses looking at how they would cover him and his supporters. We all remember the Bernie Bros making them out to seem like they're a bunch of young misogynists who are attacking women left, right, and center. And then you have the coverage of someone like Trump. Content analyses, again, show that, yes, there was a lot of negative media coverage from like CNN, MSNBC, New York Times, and so on and so forth. But the vast majority of it was neutral. And they would cover each and every single thing that he did. Oftentimes without commentary. So this only spreads that candidate's message and reinforces them as a quote-unquote anti-establishment kind of character. Even someone like Ted Cruz complained about all the free publicity Trump was getting at the expense of his rivals in the Republican primaries, because he understood that all this coverage, and I'm not going to use the whole cliche that there's no such thing as bad press, because obviously there is a thing as bad press. But in this case, it was both neutral, sometimes positive, and negative press. And in this case, the negative press only reinforced his, again, anti-establishment, anti-status quo, if you will, persona, which
and
again,
would you agree
he wasn't.
Would you agree with this? We were talking off air. Peter, I gave him a copy of Kayfabe, and we talked about wrestling and our appreciation for all things pro wrestling.
The art.
The art. I do believe it's an art. And to that point of it being an art, I do believe that Trump did learn from Vince McMahon the art of playing the villain. Because I think we have to remember that Donald Trump has been in the public imagination for about 50 years. He's been a figure, and he was never, probably until the wrestling days, did he really become a bad guy, and then he really doubles down on that with the TV show. If you remember in Home Alone, he doesn't play a bad guy in Home Alone at all. He has his little cameo appearance, but he's supposed to be somewhat of a decent figure.
Wasn't he the inspiration, though, for Gordon Gekko?
Yep.
In Wall Street?
He was also the inspiration for Gremlins 2. If you've ever seen Gremlins 2,
I don't remember Gremlins 2, to be honest.
Go back and watch it. And there's
I don't remember it, but I do remember reading that Oliver Stone was inspired by Donald Trump for the character of Gordon Gekko. And again, Gordon Gekko represents everything that's wrong with like this kind of predatory capitalism.
But, and this is where the kayfabiness of all this comes in for me. Gordon Gekko, for a lot of people, isn't necessarily an evil character. When we think about these Wall Street movies, these people tend to be portrayed as almost like anti-heroes in a way. Wolf of Wall Street. Not, these are people that are probably despicable to us and the majority of people watching these shows. But we have to be honest that, I love crime movies. There's not really heroes in mafia movies. The police would be the heroes. The feds would be the heroes in mafia movies. And they are always looked at as the heels. So Donald Trump, for me, in media, represented the perfect wrestling comic book villain. And every time a microphone was put in front of him, no matter what ridiculous thing he said, it was just must-see TV.
It's funny with regards to someone like Trump. He's always been a pop culture figure. I remember him, for instance, in what was it, Limp Bizkit video clips, or he had a skit on what was it, Tikal 2000 Method Man's album.
Yeah.
So he's always had that weird kind of relationship with like quote unquote anti-establishment figures. And then he was also, as you rightfully put it, that nice gentleman who gave Kevin McAllister directions at the Plaza Hotel, or at the same time, he was trying to buy Uncle Phil's house on the Fresh Prince of Bel-Air, if you remember that one as well.
Yeah.
The whole, like, again, anti-hero kind of heel figure that we might perceive. I think he was the baby face when he was at the WWE, going up against the evil Mr. McMahon. He was being portrayed as kind of like anti-establishment, as going up against the grain, as being tough. And this is a persona, and that's why I bring up even Limp Bizkit and Method Man. It's something that was brewing for quite some time. It's a shame, though, that Method Man at the time didn't know what his views are with regards to, let's say, immigrants. I'm sure he wouldn't have him on the album.
I don't think Donald Trump talked. The fact that think about this for a second. The fact that Donald Trump is on Method Man's album, Tikal 2000, comes out in what, 96? 95?
Something like that.
Right?
Yeah.
That's neither here nor there.
No, probably later than that, I want to say, because
was it 98?
His first album.
Okay.
And
in 1988, Donald Trump takes that ad out in the Daily News, New York Daily News, or the Times. I can't remember. New York Daily News. And he calls for the death penalty for the Central Park Five. To this day, he's never backed down on him saying that those kids are guilty of that crime that they definitely didn't commit. Donald Trump was on record at that point saying that, and it didn't bother Method Man, who is in his 50s. So he would have been an older teenager that was very aware of the wilding incident in Central Park.
Yeah.
So to kind of cast that aside and say this dude is cool, which he was. I forget how many thousands of references Donald Trump has in hip hop from the 80s to now. And they're not negative references. I think he's a figure that we've never seen before, and you can't draw any sort of parallel between him and Ronald Reagan because they're so different. Absolutely. Reagan literally had to be governor of California for a while. And he also worked, I guess you could say, politically in the actors union, ratting out people to the I can't remember the name of the commission. But Donald Trump literally walks off of the reality show set into the White House off in an insane amount of free publicity, but he is printing money for the most part for all these media outlets. And we need to really be honest with this. This is where it's going to get uncomfortable. Shows like this back then could put his name in the title thumbnail, and a bunch of people would watch.
Exactly. And that's the reason why someone like him got so much attention, because the mainstream media was already all over him, and coupled with the views and ideas of people on the far right, which, as I said earlier, are controversial. they get so much attention. It was the former head of what was it, MSNBC, I quoted in the book, that said he might be bad for America, but he's great for ratings.
Yeah.
And that's a way of treating someone like Donald Trump. I talk about this in the book too. I don't think, for instance, that Donald Trump became president because of his presence on Twitter. A lot of people talk about this. I have a lot of colleagues who study digital media. I study digital media as well. They're all about, for example, how these new digital spheres enhance, if you will, extremist viewpoints, both left and right, and so on and so forth, create these filter bubbles and all that stuff. But no, if you look at the statistics from 2016, your average American voter was not receiving their news from Twitter, and they weren't even seeing Donald Trump's tweets. What they were seeing was the coverage of Donald Trump's tweets. The fact that he would write something that was like berserk in the middle of the night, the next day it was all over the news. That is what helped him pass, or rather get his messages across. The fact that he was, again, being covered every step of the way. And again, this is what someone like Ted Cruz talked about. He was getting tens of millions in free advertisement through this excessive coverage. And this is what helped him get elected. Everything else that we talk about with regards to, let's say, social media, or at least at the time, being responsible for him getting elected and, if you will, brewing a new generation of far-right voters, I think it's kind of been over-exaggerated.
Through the social media lens.
Yeah, of course. I mean,
I agree.
Obviously, a lot has changed in the past 8 years.
Yeah.
A lot has changed in the past 8 years. Just looking at the sheer number of users on, let's say, the platform formerly known as Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, and so on and so forth, you can tell that, yes, a lot of people are getting their news from these outlets that have been tailored to their liking. They're following the media outlets that best speak to them and their views, because everything is pretty much curated by ourselves now, unless you're one of those individuals who, again, for professional reasons, follow the entire spectrum of the news media, from, again, conservative to liberal to like progressive media outlets. You're not really listening to opposing views. But at the time, Trump said something on Twitter, Trump posted something on Twitter, and it was news. Everybody
talked about it, which makes you seem more important. And would you say that there was a moment, I wrote this paper, probably 2021, maybe 2022. And I believe it's called, in Sublation, it's called like Trump is having his Chinese democracy moment. If you remember that album.
Yeah, Guns N' Roses.
Guns N' Roses.
Yeah.
That kind of marks the end of that era of the band where Axl Rose thought he could just keep doing it with all these different people.
Yeah, I know. Is it a Guns N' Roses album when everybody else was in Revolver? I mean,
yeah,
we can debate that.
Yeah, it's a stupid record, right? I shouldn't say that. It was good. It's a record I wasn't a fan of. But my point was, there was a moment where Trump wasn't getting the attention. He wasn't on Twitter anymore. I think he got banned at this point. There's still a fallout from COVID, and the Democrats went hard on January 6th. And it felt like people felt dumb for voting for him for a moment. And then there was just nothing going on in the Democratic Party. And also with the George Floyd moment, I think plays into the end of Trump as well. And I think as that wore thin for people and got a little old, and news coverage makes a extremely sharp turn from police corruption and violence to, oh my God, these brown people keep breaking into these stores. Trump's voice gets a resurgence. And also, I think these are also failures of the Democratic Party, trying to sell black people on your reparations will be through the crypto and entrepreneurial sphere. So why not, open the door back up for everybody's favorite quote unquote entrepreneur, Donald Trump?
I'm not entirely sure about that, because the man ended up getting more votes than ever before. The only difference is that Biden ended up getting more than him.
Yeah, I'm talking after that.
No, but that's my point. In
Yeah,
2020, he ended up getting a ton of votes, which means that the reason he won wasn't necessarily because his previous voters were disappointed in him. It's that people who probably didn't vote for Hillary in 2016 but didn't vote for Trump either actually cast their vote for Biden. And again, everything we say is a simple assumption, and you know what they say when you assume. You make an ass out of you and me. But what we do see, and this is something that I firmly believe, it's that he did extremely well in 2020. The only difference is that more Democrats decided to get up and cast their vote in comparison to 2016. And now, after 4 years of, again, Biden and his administration, a lot of people don't feel that he did enough to improve the quality of their life. This crisis continues to linger on. And one of the major topics was the economy and the price of eggs. So this shows that a lot of working class people care about what's going on in the economy. And as opposed to 2016, he ended up getting a lot of votes from, again, African Americans, Latino voters, and so on and so forth.
But there was, I think he got less votes in 2024 than he got in 2020.
I'm not sure about
that.
I'm
not mistaken. I don't remember. I believe there was just a short moment though in 2022 where his popularity had waned.
We were hopeful, yeah, people thought that maybe Joe Biden would improve their lives. Maybe he would have done something to make things better. And that's the problem, that people oftentimes have high expectations only to be let down. And that's what fuels far-right political movements, unfortunately, at the expense of the left, because the left isn't getting this kind of publicity in the mass media. It's oftentimes overlooked, and it's constantly being demonized. Look at, for instance, the treatment of not just someone like Bernie Sanders, but Jeremy Corbyn, or look at the treatment, for instance, of politicians in other European cities. For example, the way that Podemos in Spain was being treated, or Syriza in Greece, up until the point when they flip-flopped, that is, when they were still the radical party of the left, or all these other left-wing politicians and political parties and movements that are trying to offer alternative solutions. They're either ignored completely or demonized. And that's something that we see in both conservative media outlets and more liberal media outlets.
In your book, you critique right-wing populism as often portrayed as a radical challenge to neoliberalism, when in fact it reinforces capitalist interests. Why do you think this misperception is so widespread?
It's simple. As I said earlier, far-right populist groups tend to talk about going up against the elites, up against these interests and so on. They talk about going up against the status quo. But ultimately, and this is something we've seen throughout history, you don't see them asking, for instance, for increasing taxation on corporations, on, let's say, supporting unions and working class movements. They're not talking about, let's say, nationalizing public, or rather nationalizing certain sectors of the economy, or spending more on public services, unless they're only geared towards members of the quote unquote like people. So what you have is this kind of double speak, if you will, on the one hand, where you're trying to convince voters that you're going up against the grain and that you're doing all these things, but on the other hand, you're really not doing anything, and your policies in reality would reinforce the same kind of capitalist social structures. So that's why I talk about neoliberalism in this case being a choice of either progressive neoliberalism or reactionary neoliberalism, an idea I got from Nancy Fraser, who lays it down simply. You have, on the one hand, the kind of neoliberalism that has more progressive social views, which is great, of course. But again, since we're talking about neoliberalism, it will slowly deteriorate the living conditions of people. And again, then you have this reactionary neoliberalism, which has a lot of the same kind of economic policies, but being reactionary, it also, as I said earlier, it's quite homophobic, it's xenophobic, it's transphobic, it's racist. It's, again, got a particular agenda in mind that will lure voters as being a quote unquote alternative, a radical alternative. But in reality, it's not, because they uphold the same kind of neoliberal social structures.
Do you think all the coverage of someone like a Trump, or now Trump and Musk, which feels a little different than Trump and Bannon 8 years ago, it feels a little scarier, because the Trump and Bannon relationship didn't last very long. This Elon thing, we'll see. We'll see. Hopefully it ends, quick, fast, in a hurry. I don't know if it will, but there's so much media coverage on everything they do that it could sound like he's doing a lot more than he actually is. Now, they are both doing some horrible things, but for example, the tough talk with Colombia and Mexico and Canada, and nothing, he didn't do anything. It was just talk. The media had to cover the talk because they just can't get enough of this guy.
I mean, it's kind of hilarious if you think about it, because on the one hand, you have all this tough talk and all this talk about, for instance, hitting Canada, where I'm currently living, with all these tariffs. But then when push comes to shove, he realizes that he can't simply put a 25% tariff on all the goods that come out of Canada to the United States, because it would impact the American economy as much as it would impact the Canadian economy. And this would affect the lives of working class people on both sides of the border. So what does he do? He bans, quote unquote, disgusting paper straws. And that alone is enough to get him all this kind of attention that you're talking about. And yes, somebody like yourself and me, we might sit down and find this to be ridiculous. If it wasn't coming from Trump, it would actually be funny. But this is something that seems to appeal to quite a few of his supporters. And at the same time, you have all this coverage that, again, makes it appear as if the president is doing something. He's working hard, signing executive orders. He's changing the name of the Gulf of Mexico. He's banning paper straws, as if that's going to make the price of eggs go down. What I find even interesting is the fact that he pretty much caved to Musk and Ramaswamy when it came to the foreign worker program.
The H-1B visas?
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's what I find more interesting. The fact that there's a very significant difference with his relationship with Silicon Valley as opposed to 2016, when it appeared that they were completely against him and in favor of Clinton and supporting this like progressive, quote unquote, brand of neoliberalism, as opposed to 2025 when it was the who's who of Silicon Valley sitting behind him during the inauguration. That's something that I find more interesting. And this is something that I feel that we have to keep an eye on with regards to digital media and media in general.
As my power goes out. But that's an interesting point, because Silicon Valley is supposed to be the hippie capitalists, right? Our workers have the best conditions. Damn them if they organize, but there's nap pods at Google.
Yeah. The perks, they all work for the perks.
They work for the perks in a right to work state. Labor is something that the media doesn't cover unless there's a big strike and a president has to break it.
Another reason why the left is demonized, and I talk about this as well in the book, that, again, the labor beat, which used to exist back in the day when dinosaurs ruled the earth and they were reading newspapers, the labor beat was a thing. That labor beat no longer exists. Now it's the finance beat, if you will. We've seen this transition from how work and labor is impacted by decisions at the, again, upper echelons of political society, to how finance is impacted and shareholders. We've seen this pivot. And this is another reason why you have this demonization of the left. And these are the kind of individualistic ideologies that are reinforcing, if you will, capitalist social structures. And you see this. And unfortunately, this is what the media has been doing for quite some time now. And I think that it's relevant for me to explain what I mean by capitalism's safety net. So historically, we've had the idea that the press, the mass media, is supposed to hold those in power accountable for their actions, to hold the powerful accountable. And those were our elected officials, the people that we entrusted with our livelihood, with our safety, with, again, making sure that our children are well educated and healthy and will be able to find a good paying job that will allow them to have a life as good, if not better, than ours. The reason why we work so hard. And simultaneously, they're supposed to provide us with all that information and the news we need in order to make good decisions, to choose those powerful individuals who are, again, entrusted with our lives, pretty much. But now we see this is kind of turning upside down. It's now we see that the mass media is protecting the elites, and it's failing to hold those in power accountable, because those who are in power, and they're not necessarily our government officials, are the ones who own the mass media. They're the ones who are, if you will, concentrating the mass media and are influencing the type of news coverage that's being produced. And at the same time, we're not getting that information and the news that we need to make those proper decisions. We're being bombarded with a daily dose of infotainment instead of information. It's all about entertaining us, and we're entertaining ourselves to death now. So this is what I mean when I talk about the media functioning as a safety net for capitalism. And as we know, the term has also been used for the far right as well in times of crises. We've seen how, for example, in times of financial crisis, far right movements have always appeared to kind of support, if you will, those that are rich and powerful. We've always viewed the far right as being a crutch, if you will. But now it seems that the mass media, which we entrusted with our lives is functioning as a crutch.
Is there a way to, I don't know if you can correct it, but how do we get beyond this? Do we have to get back to the days of handing out pamphlets to the working class, which I'm not opposed to?
I mean, look, handing out pamphlets, or I don't know, sending them the link to this podcast, shout out. It's that's not going to change our world.
Yeah.
What we require are policies and regulations that will break up, for starters, the mass media. For example, there used to be a law in Canada that you weren't allowed to own a radio station and a newspaper simultaneously.
Mm-hmm.
Why? Because you would obviously have a monopoly on the control of information. And forget about a big major city. If you're looking at, for instance, smaller towns and rural areas, you would literally control the entire flow of information. And, you know, some people are happy being a big fish in a small pond. And that can be detrimental to people's lives. So we've come to the point now where, for instance, in this country, in Canada, you have a handful, if you will, of major communications companies that own the TV stations, cable companies, internet providers, phone coverage, and so on and so forth. They own the stations that are producing the news. They're also responsible for getting that news to you. And that's a monopoly on both the production and the flow of information. And that can be quite dangerous, because all of a sudden now what we have is a group of private individuals that are accountable to nobody other than their shareholders, whose only purpose is the maximization of their profits, controlling a lot of our information. And personally, I think that's worrisome. And you see something analogous in the United States too, with these media companies amassing so much power because they're absorbing entire segments of the industry. And it's also come to the point where now you have, for instance, individuals living in small rural areas who no longer have access to local media outlets, are solely dependent on these large media outlets that are usually based in the major cities. And they're the ones who are feeding them their news and their information about topics which don't really impact them or their communities directly. And that's also problematic. So something has to be done to break up these monopolies and to encourage, if you will, the creation of new, smaller media outlets, whether we're talking about online or, I don't know, television, paper. That's besides the point. How do people get their news? Okay, that's what we need to encourage at the moment. And just look at, for instance, how the mass media functions with regards to ownership.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not saying, for instance, that the owner of a major publication, like let's say the Washington Post, like Mr. Bezos, will tell his newsrooms how to write news, what to produce, and so on and so forth. But when he makes his views abundantly clear through Twitter or X, whatever you want to call it, that can impact the way that his employees do their job. I mean, like, let's not kid ourselves. Nobody wants to like make their boss angry because they know that might impact their career.
Yeah, you want to say the right things to move up the ladder. No, I get it. Wherever you're watching or listening to the show, there's links in the description to Peter's book. It's the first line in the description is a link to Peter's book. It's always the first line. So don't say, hey, where can we find Peter's book? There's a link in the description. It's the first line in the description for Peter's book. Peter, what else are you working on before we go?
So for the time being, I'm a father, a new father, so I'm working on raising a young daughter.
Congratulations.
Thank you. Trying to be a good husband, trying to be a good dad, but professionally speaking, I'm working and I'm researching my next book. I'm hoping it'll come out in the next maybe year or two. It's kind of hard with, again, raising, as I said, a family and at the same time teaching multiple courses. But I'm working on a new book that I see as a continuation of this and looking at the new, if you will, face of the far right and looking at how, for instance, for lack of a better term, autocracy or mob rule or majoritarianism has become the new face of the far right, which justifies, if you will, the kind of, let's call it the overhaul of liberal institutions.
Mm-hmm.
It's something I've been thinking about for quite some time. It's kind of trying to make sense of how we can see, for instance, democracy get eroded. But at the same time, I wanted to be more critical than a lot of these mainstream academics or authors that look at, for instance, the, if you will, slow demise of liberal democratic institutions and blame it solely, for instance, on something like the election of right-wing populist leaders and not looking at the fact that this is something that's been going on for a long time, slowly by slowly, because we've been witnessing the slow demise of democracy through, if you will, the lack of economic democracy.
To say the least, there's a lack of economic democracy. Peter, thank you very much for taking the time to talk with me. I know it's late if you're a dad. I'm sure there's daddy things you have to do.
I don't sleep anymore. It's fine. I probably would have been up anyways.
I've been a dad for a minute. I had my daughter when I didn't have it. I was there when she came out, when I was 21. And she came home and we were tired, of course, and she cried and it woke us up. And the sun was rising. I remember seeing the sunrise. And that was the moment I knew I will never sleep in again.
Yeah, it's true. It's true. But honestly, I wouldn't change a thing. And I'm sure that you wouldn't either.
Oh, no. And then they get to be a certain age where they enjoy sleep and then you just wake them up.
Yeah, that's when they're on autopilot, right?
Yeah. They're grown now. But if they were to come down here, they would know that, well, if we come to dad's house, he's going to wake us up at some ungodly hour because he's an a-hole. It's like, oh no, it's payback for your colic. That's all it is.
There you go. You wanted a formula at 3 o'clock in the morning.
It's taking notes. It's taking notes the whole time. Petty dad.
All jokes aside, thank you so much for having me. It was a pleasure to be here. Hopefully we can do it again sometime.
Yes.
And yeah, all I can say is if you're interested, pick up the book, Capitalism's Safety Net, News Media and the Far Right. Unfortunately, I do know it's a little pricey. I'm not the person who sets those prices. I know how it is, but you know what? At the end of the day, that's what libraries are for. Thank heavens they still exist.
There you go. Thank you very much, Peter. Have a very good rest of your night. Do your dad stuff. I'm jealous a little bit. Wish I could do dad stuff right now. It's fun. It's fun being a parent. And yes, I am vindictive and will stay up all night and then wake them up super early in the morning. Just as a payback. It gives me strength almost. Seeing the groggy faces gives me strength. Thank you guys. No champagne room tonight because we did a bunch of shows this week and tomorrow. We're going to try to stream from the Rainbow as much as we can. Probably most likely from Instagram. I'd be surprised if we did anything from YouTube, but who knows? We'll try to do something. Don't know how loud it's going to be over there. And plus, they play music that's licensed, and if the YouTube pulls it down, then we'll be all pissed off. But we'll try. But definitely, if you guys can't make it out to the Rainbow, come out to UC Irvine and hang out with Ben and I at the West Coast Platypus Conference. So I looked over and Nuri said, just go make some weird bougie coleslaw. So mad at you guys for making fun of my coleslaw. There's nothing bougie about it. And I don't appreciate what you guys said about dried cranberries being bougie raisins. Thank you guys for hanging out with me. And let's see, where is it at? Let's go out with the cool music. Out.